All right, I am now here with Alex Gourevitch. He is a professor of political science at Brown University and the author of the book From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth. And he's joining us today to talk about his latest article for Catalyst, which is titled Post-Work Socialism? Alex, great to see you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So the title of your article says it all. You have some questions with post-work socialism. And I want to just start with kind of basic definitions, I guess, because I think, for lots of people who are watching this program, probably are vaguely or, very familiar with what post-work or anti-work mean. And, for my part, I remember kind of anti-work and post-work having a big moment after Occupy. Full disclosure, that's when I first was acquainted with it, and I thought it was very interesting. There's a lot of it that I still agree with. I think, right after Occupy, everybody I knew who was in a reading group was reading Kathy Week's book, The Problem with Work. And, I think more recently, we've seen another kind of second wave of interest in post-work / anti-work because of the kind of dialogue around the so-called Great Resignation, right? So, I should say that in your piece, you are quite clear that you find value in a lot of post-work thinking as well. So maybe just to kind of kick off, how exactly would you characterize post-work or anti-work thinking? And before we get to some of your questions and criticisms, what do the post-work theorists get right?
Cool. Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that post-work socialism is one kind of answer to the general socialist question of what kind of freedom is a future socialist society offering its members? Mm-hmm. And their answer is it's a society without work. And it's a society without work because it's one in which nobody's forced to work because everybody gets an unconditional basic income or some other way of unconditionally supplying them with their basic needs. And importantly, it's a society also where there's no work ethic. So it's a society in which you won't be ostracized or dishonored or shamed or fail to have some public standing if you choose not to work. Mm-hmm. And those are kind of equally important, I think, in post-work thinking, because the thought is if you gave everyone a UBI, as the unconditional basic income is known, and they had everything they need to live, but you still had the work ethic that's in some way familiar to us, people would still feel kind of such intense social pressure to work, to do something specific with their time, that they wouldn't really enjoy free time. Mm. And so the post-work socialist vision is an answer to that question of what kind of freedom do we enjoy in a future society by saying it's a society not just freed from work, but where people really have free time. Their whole lives are lives of free time to do what they like. Right. And it's, said like that, it's obviously a very compelling view. And I'll say that it's sort of, in a way, it's a kind of view that when I first got really interested in Marxism, it was through the question, well, if we have so much technology, why do people work so much? That was sort of a question I asked somebody who then was like, "You're a Marxist," and I was like, "Really? Right. I don't think so." And then I was like, turned out I had been taught Marx badly, and so on. So I came to it through there, and then I remember the Kathy Weeks moment. I actually had a conversation with her at I think New York Public Library, or not New York Public Library, but Brooklyn. Anyway, when that came out, and I remember it, and it was a big moment, and I was really taken by that book as an expression of this view. So, so that's what post-work socialism is, and in its many variants. It's an answer to the kind of freedom that we should enjoy.
Right. And you've hinted at this, but what do you think that they get right, the post-work theorists, before we move into some of the other questions?
Sure. There's a few things I think they get right. So one is they obviously get right something that a lot of people can agree with, which is that there are many jobs in our society that are unnecessary, that suck, that are super exploitative, or that even if they are in some way necessary, important, are done under really unacceptable, exploitative conditions. So they get right, I think, a basic thought that our way of organizing labor is through force, compulsion, domination. That's the central mechanism by which a capitalist society gets most of its labor to be done. I think it also gets right a thought that the way the work ethic functions in our society is to kind of induce cooperation with that subordination. We'll get to it later. Maybe I disagree with how they interpret the work ethic, but I do think they get aspects of that right. And the other thing I think they get right is that there's a real promise to technology, at least some post-work socialists. I mean, it's a, there's a lot of different sub-views, but right. I'd say the pulse of especially the people who are more kind of futuristic, like Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams, to a degree Kathy Weeks, that there's this immense productive potential that capitalism generated and continues to generate, but which seems to, instead of reducing the hours of labor anybody has to work, seems to, on the one hand, just produce unemployment, and on the other hand, make work kind of worse. And that's just a standard Marxian thought, and I think that it's an important thought for them when they think about why we could have a post-work future. So I think those are three important thoughts that form a kind of jumping off point for them.
Right. So maybe now let's turn to the question of UBI, universal basic income, which you had brought up earlier, because as you point out, this is kind of like the main sort of policy proposal of the post-work thinkers. I will say just very briefly for UBI, it's a little bit confusing because I think over the last couple of years, there's been kind of some mainstream dialogue or like mainstream confusion around this idea of UBI, where sometimes when people say UBI, what they're proposing is not actually universal or, it's not actually basic, by which I mean it won't actually ensure anybody a basic standard of living. Putting all of that aside, what the post-work theorists are proposing, of course, is a universal basic income that, like I said, everybody gets, regardless of whatever. It's actually 100% universal and basic in the sense that it will actually ensure a sort of floor of standard of living for everybody. That sounds great, and as you alluded to earlier, that does seem like something that would kind of undercut the power of employers and of capitalists. I think it was Eric Olin Wright, who had the sort of famous formulation that, workers are not just separated from the means of production, but also from the means of subsistence. So if we can at least guarantee the second part of that, that seems like a huge step forward. But the heart of your article is really kind of taking that assumption and sort of taking it apart. So why can UBI, which sounds great, not actually deliver us a post-work society?
Good, yeah. So what in the article, what I'm looking at is the role of the UBI in the wider post-work argument, because there are about 10,000 different kinds of arguments for UBI, as you say.
Right.
And it's impossible to really address them all at once because they're actually very different arguments for sometimes very different policies. So I'm not trying to make a general argument about UBI. I'm just trying to make an argument about how post-work socialism thinks about freedom through this really crucial policy device. Because the role of the UBI in the post-work vision is the reason we're free is because all of our basic needs are met, not conditional on working. Right? So the UBI in the post-work vision then has to be unconditional on working, universal, right? It's for everybody. Basic in the sense that it is at a level high enough to meet all of your basic needs. So it's not partial, right? And it's an income. It's given to you in the form of some money where you then choose sort of the particular basic goods that you're going to buy. So, and the reason, just, again, just to hammer home the point is this is going to matter because it's claimed that this UBI emancipates everybody because it means that nobody's forced to work and we can be socially indifferent about what people choose to do with their time. That's the really important sort of fact about the UBI in a post-work socialist view. And I think that is that it's deceptive, that it's deceptive because when you imagine a society like this, they're saying, look, come be a socialist and join our particular struggle because we're offering you a future society in which everyone can be free in this way. No one's going to be forced to work and we can be indifferent as to how people choose to use their time. The problem is that in that world, the post-work socialists are presupposing the very thing that they're saying they're freeing us from. They're presupposing a whole bunch of necessary labor that they're then saying nobody has to do. Right. Nobody's forced to do. And they're presupposing it because for the UBI to work in that world, there have to be things to buy. And not just any goods, right? It can't be like, toy sailboats and tennis balls and, like paper napkins. It's got to be the basic goods, right? We have to be able to meet all of our basic needs by buying the basic goods that we need to survive. And it's not just basic goods. It has to be enough basic goods that everybody could buy them at the same time with their UBI. And it has to be not just enough basic goods at today. It's got to be basic goods plus all the raw materials and industrial machinery that's available to produce the basic goods tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So you have to produce and reproduce all those raw materials and do all the production of the machines that are going to produce your basic goods next time. So the food, the clothing, the medical care, the teaching, the child care, all this stuff. And some of this physical good, a lot of this is actually physical goods. So for the UBI to be emancipating in the way they say, right? Because you've got to be able to buy this stuff. Somebody's got to be producing all those goods that you buy.
Right.
But who's doing that? Right. So it's presupposing all this necessary labor. And so there's something very deceptive about saying this is a free society in the sense that nobody's forced to work and we can be indifferent to what people do with their free time. In fact, you could say it might be true that it's not conditional on any particular individual doing work, but it is conditional on some people, on many people doing quite a bit of work,
right?
To produce those necessary goods,
right? So yeah, let's stay on this question of necessary labor, right? Why does the kind of post-work explanation of technology and automation as a way to deal with that labor that would have to occur in a post-work society, not cover all the bases? Because as you kind of hinted at earlier, we hear all the time that capitalism produces not just bad jobs, but like what David Graeber called bullshit jobs, like completely like pointless kind of make work tasks, and that there probably is a better and more efficient way of organizing work. But again, this is to say, why does technology and automation not cover all of the questions of necessary labor?
Sure. Yeah, if it did, then we wouldn't have to worry about the fact that some labor has to be done, right?
Right.
And that'd be good news, because really the problem for the post-work socialist view isn't just that it presupposes the necessary labor, that it has to be done, and implies that it's kind of not a political problem that we have to solve. Like how are we going to determine what counts as the needs, and then who's going to do the necessary labor, and on what terms, and how's that going to be distributed, or like what's going to count as necessary. But then we also have reason to worry that in the post-work social society, uniquely, nobody would do it, because not only are people being given this UBI, but also they've attacked the work ethic, which would be the other source of motivation to work, right? So they've successfully destroyed any of the ways in which you might have a general supply of labor to do it. And they've just avoided, and I should just parenthetically, because at this point people might think that I'm just some kind of capitalist, I've written this in order to defend a different view, which I call shared labor socialism.
We'll get to that.
Where we share. Yeah, good. I just want to make sure at this stage someone doesn't press, but
right.
Jacobin invited a crazy capitalist. So, so it's worse, right? They presuppose necessary labor without acknowledging it and give us reason to believe it wouldn't be done, in which case the UBI would be useless and you'd fall back into some other labor system. But then what about automation? And I think the problem with automation is this. I think automation is a partial solution to the problem, but it's a partial and subordinate one. It's not the answer. And the reason is there are many jobs that you could automate, many forms of necessary labor that probably would get automated if there were if we already lived in a democratic and socialist society in which we were able to collectively control and decide what's going to be automated and what isn't, rather than leaving up to what is profitable to automate. But it's only a partial subordinate one because there are some forms of labor that are intrinsically not automatable. So that's one thing, right? There are many forms of caring labor that are just intrinsically not automatable. Teaching, caring, all kinds of medical provision. And there's quite a bit of that labor, especially in a society, and in a, kind of an advanced industrial society, where there's a lot more of that work to do. Right? So that's one thing. I think there's intrinsically not automatable work. There's other kinds of work where you can probably automate like 90% of it, but people still need to do some of it. And in the long term, in any sort of future I can kind of imagine, that's work that some people will have to do. There's also the work of maintaining the machines, right? There's all kinds of work. Automation gets rid of some labor and creates new labor. And it does that continuously. Like we see that with machines, right? That's that you can kind of eliminate 10 jobs, but you create 1 or 2 new ones that human beings have to do. Right. And then there is just sort of labor of superintendents. There's people who still have to be there managing and watching machines. So it might not be particularly effortful, but it still requires human beings. So that's one class of reasons why I think that automation's a partial one. So I do think that it's true in a democratic socialist society. In one sense, necessary labor, you could automate away a lot of labor. You wouldn't just get rid of the bullshit jobs, right? You could automate a lot of labor and reduce the necessary labor people have to do to a relatively small share of the work week. So I'm not rejecting that. But the one other thing I wanted to say is that the 2 other reasons I think automation isn't as strong an answer as post-work socialists have made it out to be, and I have to say I used to think that too. So I this is sort of self-criticism as well, is first, you can't automate automation. So you first have to have a political process of determining what's going to count as a need. You have to have some political determination of needs or some social choice about needs to know then what's the kind of labor we're going to call necessary and therefore want to automate away first. Right? Or reduce through automation. And automation isn't self-automating, right? People sometimes just think it's just assumed we can just automate any task can be automated and we do it. But there's an infinite number of needs that can be satisfied. And machines can't tell us where we should direct our efforts. At any given moment in time, we can't automate everything. Right. So that's a political problem. That's part of the political problem of necessary labor, is deciding what's going to count. The second is that there's a way in which necessary labor, all things being equal, will increase in a future emancipated society because human needs will expand. And I think post-work socialists are really kind of much more vague about this than they are clear. Sometimes they talk about needs as just what we need to survive. That's the UBI thing, right? Oh, well, so long as we have our basic needs met, then there are no other needs, right? There's nothing else that must be produced. Right. Everything else is just free time. But as a kind of Marxist, and I think it's a pretty standard thought in a lot of Marxism and socialism, part of the point of emancipated society is that our needs expand. It's capitalism that reduces people's needs to what it takes to show up to work the next day, right? The basic needs thing. But a future society is one in which we have a need for the development and realization of our talents. But that actually requires an immense amount of resources. If you want to be a scientist, or you want to be an urban planner, or you want to be involved in urban planning, right? If you want to, kind of stage massive music concerts, you can just think of a million tasks, right? That require resources. You need access to some share of the means of production, not just the means of subsistence. Right. If what you want is to realize and, develop and realize that aspect of you and contribute it to society. But that takes resources. So all that stuff has to be produced, and we have to think of those goods as necessary. So there's going to be an increase in necessary labor, which means there's more tasks that would have to be automated, or at least an expansion of necessary labor from that perspective.
Right. So I think on that note, let's maybe then turn to your vision of a kind of different post-capitalist or a socialist society, right?
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and say in your piece you advocate for something that you called shared labor socialism, and I have a few questions about that, but I think maybe let's start with this kind of idea of work ethic, since as you pointed out, that is a big part of the kind of post-work framework. So we've already discussed the kind of post-work critique of the work ethic. Where does your kind of framework disagree with the post-work thinkers on this? And maybe another way of asking the question is, what do you think a socialist or like at least non-capitalist work ethic might look like?
Yeah, thanks. So it's a really good question. And I'll be honest, there's parts of this I'm still working out for myself, because in some way I feel like I can say I came to this honestly, in the sense that this isn't how I originally thought. And I found I originally found it unnatural to think this way. I was with the post-work socialists. And when I thought more and more about it, and especially this, why the interest in the work ethic, came to the conclusion that there's something actually quite fundamental to the post-work view, which was this one, which underlies the work ethic thing, which is I think that a lot of post-work thinking, and this is also what's going on in the automation stuff, is the idea that because work is necessary, it must be unfree. And I realized that's just not true, as it turns out. All right, that I think is actually a first thing to say. Just because something's necessary does not make it unfree. And that's because what's necessary is also indeterminate. Right? It's true, some work has to be done, but which work and under which conditions and by whom is not determined. That's why we have, like history, we have modes of production, we have different work relations, is because that isn't given to us. And it's capitalism, in a way, that constantly kind of reduces work into something merely necessary, just a means to some other ends. That's in part because all work is organized around profit, right? The workers, the conditions under which they work are determined by whether hiring them and having them work that way is profitable. And you have no reason to do work for the sake of profit. But in a shared labor socialist society, as I see it, it would change the character of the necessary labor, because necessary labor would be shared. Everyone would do some, so that nobody had to spend their whole life doing all of it. And it would be work that everyone has a reason to do, therefore, because it means that they are not contributing their efforts to a society that just uses them. They're contributing their efforts to a society that has their freedom as its aim, right? And you start that by sharing the necessary labor. That reduces the amount that anyone has to do to a relatively small amount. It does create real free time then to use time as you like, including to go and develop and contribute your talents if you want. But that would then mean that work has been transformed from something merely necessary into something that is an expression of human solidarity. And therefore, even that part of the day that is in some sense necessary, right, is something that could be the expression of a kind of duty people have as free people, right? We only have duties if we're free, right? If we can choose to do it for the sake of doing it as a duty, not just because we're sort of just forced to do it. And I think this is actually one of the oldest thoughts in communism. It goes back to Gracchus Babeuf, the first kind of modern communist, which is to say that we can transform work into a kind of civic act, whereby we contribute our abilities to the creation of society that is organized for the sake of everyone's freedom. And so that means that even the necessary part of the day, as it were, becomes an expression of our freedom and becomes an act of solidarity rather than mere necessity. And I know that sounds in some ways very abstract, but I think it matters because to me, it's the part of the work ethic even today that I think is at once reasonable and incipiently socialist. When people, the post-work view of the work ethic is to say it's just a capitalist ideology. It's just a way of inducing people to consent to their own exploitation. And I think that that's not the way ideology tends to work, at least not in this case. What it does is take something totally reasonable in people, which is that everybody should do their share. Right? That's the incipiently socialist thought. Yeah, everybody should do their share. But the problem in capitalism, there's no way for people to do their share in a way that isn't already sort of just contributing to the maintenance and reproduction of a capitalist society. Right. That's the problem, right? Is their subjective orientation is just in conflict with just the objective institutional meaning of what they do. And so it's natural for some people to kind of react against that and say, well, I just refuse. Like the true way out of this ideology is I refuse. I don't want to do any work. I'm going to reject work. I'm going to refuse. I'm going to be against it. But the problem is that attitude is just as ideological as the work ethic one, because then it just flips the whole situation on its head and says, well, work can't be meaningful. It can be nothing but a form of kind of externally imposed necessity on us. And I think the problem is it's not, in the end, what's in our heads. It's the institutional organization of work. And so I'm inclined to think that a shared labor society would be based on its own work ethic, a widespread norm that everybody ought to do their share. And in fact, if everybody were ready, or if, the vast majority of people were ready to do their share, you wouldn't need to force them. You wouldn't need to force anyone to do it, because they would do it spontaneously, right? They do it freely. You wouldn't need to compel them. You wouldn't need to, constrain benefits so that people were forced to work for their benefits. In fact, there'd be good reason to think that we wouldn't make the share of what people produce dependent on how much work they do, because we would want work to be done for non-instrumental reasons, right? The whole idea would be for work to be an expression of our freedom and solidarity. We wouldn't attach what you earn to the amount of effort you put in. Right. We would just say you do your share, and in exchange, you get a share of what you need to be a kind of self-developing person who can contribute their talents to society.
Right. Let me ask you this, though. Does this conception maybe rest on like an assumption about human nature? Because, humans being humans, I just can't help but think there's always going to be somebody who's like, I'd rather kick up my feet and not do the work, right? And in terms of, I think what you're proposing, in some distant socialist future, everybody has to work 4 hours a week doing the kind of undesirable or necessary labor tasks that can't be automated away. You show up, for a very reduced time at the factory or whatever, tinkering with the robots that are doing the other work, that's all well and good. But I guess, maybe talk a little bit more about how you see this work ethic kind of cohering.
Good. It's a hard question to answer only because it's unclear to me what is human nature and how we know it compared to just sort of human beings as we have encountered them in a world that we've made.
Right.
So, some people think, well, people are always going to shirk. If you don't force people to work, they're just not going to work. And that is, an old conservative view, or it's predominantly conservative. But to the degree that we worry this might just be inscribed in our nature, it's worth pointing out that I think a future shared labor socialist society would have social norms. It would have a work ethic, which means that we would tend to disapprove of people who didn't do their share, right? Because we can't be socially indifferent to what other people do. And I think we can't be socially indifferent because no individual satisfies their needs through their own labor. We're all mutually interdependent. And that means that we can't actually be totally indifferent to what people do with their time. Our freedom depends upon how we institutionally set this up and upon what others do. And the question is just whether we can accept the demands of others as reasons for our own action or not, right? So one answer then is, well, to the degree that people might be naturally reluctant to even do their share, in this, future kind of emancipated society, there would be social pressure.
Right.
We wouldn't force them, right? Well, that's the ideal, right?
Right.
So the ideal is you wouldn't force them, right? We wouldn't have it wouldn't be conscription at gunpoint. It wouldn't be that you won't live if you don't do your share, right? So there would be that, but there would be, unlike the post-work view, there wouldn't be this social indifference towards what people do with their time. You would be socialized into a society in which it was held to be a good thing to be ready to contribute your talents and abilities to society generally, and where that would mean you don't just get total personal choice over your time. right? There's social determination of what the needs are, what the valuable contributions are, at least when you're ready just to do your share of what has to be done. But probably, I can't imagine that not bleeding into how you use your free time generally. Right? We would tend to then admire, oh, look at the person who kind of invented this incredible machine that now makes it possible for everyone to dispose of all of their household waste without anyone having to be involved in garbage collection or something. Like that would be an invention, right? Look at the person who figured out how to, actually create tunnels from city to city so that we could, use underground trains traveling at multiple times the speed of sound. That would be a huge enterprise involving a lot of people using their free time, right? So to some degree, then the answer is, well, people will feel sometimes quite intense social pressure, right, to use their time. But I think, ideally we would also tolerate some degree, right, of people not doing it. The second thing is, I just don't think it's true. It's true that we enjoy kicking our feet up and socializing and having free time, and there would be, I think, a lot more time for that. But I think that our sense of what we want to do with our free time is so intensely shaped with how work is organized now that I find it. I'm not inclined to think that we can observe how people use their time now as a really good guide. Right. And people have a reason to want to make a mark on society, to make something of themselves. Yeah. And at the very minimum, we'd have to live in a society that made it possible for everyone to do that, even if they didn't take that opportunity. Okay. And that would require the resources to do that, right? Like the thought experiment I give is like, imagine we want to make it possible for people to pursue a scientific career if they wanted. So that means they'd have to be educated in basic science. Like, just imagine what it would take for every high school to have like a proper chemistry lab so they could learn chemistry. It's actually like a lot. Yeah. We have really shitty, school systems. So like you go to private school and have really good, or if you go to like a wealthy suburban high school, then you have good chemistry labs. What if everybody did? That's actually takes a lot. You got to produce a lot. You got to need all the beakers and the acids and the bases and all whatever. I don't remember my high school chemistry very well. But
that wouldn't be your chosen career path.
Yeah. Before you even get to the point then of thinking, well, I'm going to see if I can, try to be a scientist.
So maybe then this is obviously a broad question, and it is a little bit outside the scope of your article, but I do want to ask, you have this vision of shared labor socialism. What are kind of the steps or reforms that could put us on that path? And the reason I ask that, of course, is because the big thing for the post-work theorists is, as we've been discussing, UBI. So are there policy proposals that you think, kind of move us in that direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, it's a good question because one of the arguments I made, and one of the reasons I thought it was important to do this critique of post-work socialism, is that one very reasonable claim they make is any struggle, the development of any left-wing political struggle today would require a vision of the future. Right. Something that makes the struggle worth it, since it's risky, it's timely, it's, it's long-term. Many of the people involved now will never see it, all that kind of thing. So it has to be something that's really compelling enough. And I wanted to point out that these weird ways in which they presuppose the very thing that they say they emancipate us from, and even more so than their hostility to the work ethic, is in the end a liability, because all they can end up doing is then seeing people who are committed to the work ethic as politically problematic. They don't see what's reasonable in already existing views about the work and the work ethic. And I think many people are resistant to the UBI, not for ideological reasons, but for reasonable reasons. They understand that some work has to be done, and that therefore some different kind of political visions needed to avoid the political liabilities of that post-work view, no matter how much it might seem compelling. But that was a negative point. It was to say, what's attractive, I think, about shared labor socialism is that it overcomes some of the political liabilities of the kind of deceptions and mistakes of the post-work view. But I don't think I have any political policy to offer that would take us there. And that's because I don't think the problem is policy one. I don't think there's a kind of midpoint or a first step thing. Because I think the fundamental problem is the lack of a well-organized workers' movement. So the answer to your question would be, because there's no way of getting there without a very well-organized workers' movement with its own party, that's able to actually control, because it would involve a dramatic change in property relations, right? And it would involve an immense conflict. And so that immense conflict can only be won if there's already a very well-organized workers' movement that has its own party that it can control in a democratic way, that could be used then to, seize the state and reorganize the economy. And so the answer is whatever, and I don't claim to have an answer to this. I'm just saying the form of the answer would be, if there are policies that would help and assist the development of that movement, then that's the one, right? So, sometimes I think people sniff out that the problem with the UBI is there's a suspicious amount of support for it amongst neoliberals, right?
Right, yeah.
And I think the truth of that is that here and now, what a UBI is demobilizing, not mobilizing. And the clearest example, I think, was COVID, right? We got everyone to stay indoors without protest by paying them off. And the most intense form of demobilization that we've had in a very long time. So, that's a kind of background resistance I have to UBI is the UBI, like anything right now, is not going to be the expression of workers' power that they would use then to build more power. It's going to be individualizing, atomizing. So I don't think we can really say policy X does something absent the political context and whose victory it is. And so the problem's a political one. So all I can do is offer this as a vision that I think is more essential and compelling as a way of thinking about freedom, and which one could offer through the agency of some independent political party. It's a standard. It's also, in a way, where you can see UBI getting absorbed into democratic thinking. I have trouble believing they'd really go in for shared labor socialism. So I think it would have to be the offering of a real independent political party from the mainstream parties. And what it would mean, I don't think there's, so that's my answer,
Yeah. All right. Well, Alex Gourevitch, again, has an article in Catalyst titled Postwork Socialism, ? Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for the interview. It was great.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.